Maintain your integrity. You need to establish your goals and your principles, your operating procedures and principles as you become involved, and you don't veer from them without good reason. Of course, always flexibility is required, and where you're flexible and where you're not, that's of course another question. But it's imperative to always be as open and as honest as possible, and you'll be respected for it.
That's Chris Burke, speaking about some general tips for effective communication. Chris has an incredibly diverse background and is a communications expert with extensive experience in conflict situations. Chris is an Australian, and after a broad range of international projects, settled in Kampala, Uganda, where he's made his home for over 20 years and is a sought-after on-the-ground professional to execute and consult on major projects for organizations including CARE, USAID, the World Food Programme, the WWF, UNICEF, and the Carter Center, to name a few. He played an instrumental role in the implementation of the Nairobi Peace Agreement. He's sought after for his experience with land-related conflicts, including land tenure and socially responsible and compliant agro-forestry practices. He spearheaded many sensitization campaigns, was involved in UN peacekeeping operations in South Sudan. He even initiated and directed the undertaking of establishing the first commercial FM radio station in Juba. I'm your host, Warren Hoffman, and in this episode we'll be talking about the role of communication in political conflict. We talk about the role of culture, the impact of communication technologies on violent conflict, the role of trust in communication, tactics to address infodemics, sensitization campaigns, general tips for foreign aid workers, and much more.
This is Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, podcast of the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation.
Hi, Chris. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Good to catch up again after so long. Thank you. The pleasure's mine.
So I've done my best at a brief summary of your professional experience. You've got an incredible range of expertise. Are you able to give just a quick snapshot of your interests and career to date?
Well, as you said, I've had a very diverse career. Maybe if I summarize it in terms of just the geography, for the first 10 years of my career, I was based in primarily Japan, Korea, and China. I actually did a master's degree at Yonsei University in South Korea, and I worked at a research institute looking at state-state relations. The focus of my research at that time, or the focus of my studies and my work, was Chinese security relations. So I spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, as I said, focused on state-state conflict, and then refocused to Southeast Asia. I did a brief stint in East Timor, before moving to Africa, where I've been for the last 20 years. And there I started primarily in conflict mediation support around the Nairobi Peace Agreement. And it was from there that I moved more broadly into communications and advocacy. I established the first commercial FM radio station in South Sudan, in Juba, around 2004, 2005, with a couple of partners. I did a lot of work on China's engagement across Africa. They moved really into the development sector, squarely looking at a range of different issues. That's where I got involved in land, primarily land governance, and then land communications for around 10 years before. More recently, around 3-4 years ago, broadening into communications, where I've worked for WMC Africa as a communications and PR agency, really focused continentally on a range of communications and public relations marketing issues across Africa. And one of the key areas has been around social marketing or development communications, and communications in crisis and conflict situations are among those.
So I want to dive right in here and start with the topic of culture. You have extensive experience working across many different cultures, not only in the context of conflict and peace building, but in terms of negotiations across a wide range of projects. I mean, there's several theories about how cultural differences can affect negotiations. The common one is the individualism versus collectivism. Whether culture organizes around the individual or the group. There's stuff about time sensitivity. Can you talk about cultural differences in communication styles? Are there any noticeable differences? And if so, are they significant enough that they could actually impact negotiations and so on?
So, well, of course, cultural differences are important, and these are closely tied to environment, different environments, and the different types of conflicts that we can come across. But fundamentally, as human beings, we receive, analyze, and respond to conflict primarily in the same way. Or as a mediator, yes, you need to be aware of the cultural context, but a lot is excused because people will be very focused on finding resolution to their problems. But also you need to remember that these different groups, whether it's rebels or governments, are usually operating in the same region. So while they might be of different cultural orientation, they've usually got a long history of interaction and engagement. And they'll have each other worked out, and they'll know each other's strengths and weaknesses. Uh-huh. And they'll ultimately be able to communicate and push forward for peace if they see a benefit in that.
So you've been the point of contact to communicate with a number of violent groups and individuals, including rebel leaders, to arrange for peace talks. And there's certainly going to be a large amount of suspicion and distrust about your intentions. Do you have any insights on communication methods to increase trust? Or even the flip side of that, is there anything that clearly decreases trust? So how are you preparing for those discussions?
Honesty, as simple as that. Credibility, of course. Credibility and the power or capacity to convene, to bring different stakeholders, the protagonists, but different stakeholders together, and having the capacity to represent them in some sort of way in the different aspects of the mediation process.
Okay, so honesty, number one, but things like your capacity, your ability to convene can also contribute to your perceived trustworthiness. Have you ever been in a situation where you've sensed a large amount of distrust about your intentions, and what could you do in that situation?
No, I haven't. Really, I don't believe so. It was, of course, there was always I've been in many environments where there was an institutional level of distrust, let me say, but a personal level or a level that might have any impact on me personally, no. But I've always been very conscious of this as an issue, and that's how I've selected the areas that I work in.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way I would ever have gone to a conflict in Afghanistan or the Middle East. And it's because where my people were part of it. And I say like this Western Anglo-Saxon, the Americans, the Brits, the Australians were in there doing something we shouldn't have been. It was usually greed or oil. I guess East Timor, there was a big part of it. What Australia did in East Timor was just shocking. Mm-hmm. And it was Australia's interests and America's interests. I don't know if you know much about that part of the world, the politics there, but it was just, there was worse, as bad as anybody's done anywhere else to like a small neighboring state in terms of pulling people around and ignoring ugly things that go on. Do you see what I'm getting at? If you're going into a place where Canada is somehow involved, then, be wary of that and be conscious of it.
So,
and you would be conscious of it. But I think that also in terms of mediation, I think it's a conflict. Of course, it's a conflict of interests of sorts, and it puts a mediator at some level of risk.
So in a sense, though, you want to avoid situations where there's sort of this inherent distrust or potential for distrust. So not through you personally, but through your allegiance or background or whatnot.
Yeah, at least, but then it depends on what, you could, if you're a junior clerk on a team that's doing that, maybe that's a great experience, but you just have to be mindful. Certainly the way I operated, and I guess operate, is I go out into the field, I really expose myself. So I'm very mindful with what I've said or pushed around, that it doesn't come bite me in the ass in an inopportune moment, if you understand what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Have you noticed any common communication tactics that are relied on when there are fairly significant power differentials between the parties? So, for example, the state and rebel groups. I mean, there's clearly going to be different access to public communication channels. Do you see the reliance on propaganda, or are there any trends you see here with power differentials in communication?
Yes, of course. And you touched on it. Rebels and dissidents or disenfranchised groups have traditionally had less access to different forms of media. But this, of course, has been changing constantly over the last century and well before. Mobile phones, remember, just only started 20 years ago. So this before that, we were looking at satellite phones and fax machines. Now I can send all of this from the palm of my hand, and communications have had a fundamental impact. And digital media, of course, has really started to level the playing field. Of course, there's great areas that don't have access. Some areas are more accessible than others. Certainly many conflict areas, large areas don't have access to telecommunications. Conflict or post-conflict situations, environments, generally have less access to telecommunications than others. But FM radio, of course, is still the sharpest tool in the development box for reaching out. But as I said, digital media. Mm-hmm. And this is a real game changer. And while in parts of Uganda, it's only 40% of people in urban areas. I think 40% of people in urban areas have access to internet, and it's significant less it's I think around 15% in rural areas that have access to internet. But this is changing at a dramatic rate. And in another 10 years, telecommunications, let me say internet, will be accessible, and this will level things out.
Right. Enhanced communication abilities will be such a powerful tool, leveling things out, as you say. I'd assume rebel groups could become perhaps more organized to coordinate internal operations. They might be better able to gather sympathizers for their cause. I'm sure there's numerous advantages. Have you seen any evidence of this already? Has increased communication abilities changed the dynamics of these violent conflicts?
Yes, the impact has been very, very significant and can be noticed across the board. Most recently, you can see what's happened in Afghanistan. The way that the Taliban have been using communications is very different to 20 years ago. In Africa, it's very much the same thing. And I don't think it's the rebel groups necessarily becoming more organized and strengthening their capacity to coordinate internal communications, but rather the fact that communications have just been so simple, have become so simple and so accessible that people right throughout the rank and file can use them and can have access to them, and to put the word out to communicate with the world what the issues are. In the past, it was only the governments or states that had access very often to communications, and they would be able to tell the story as they wanted. But now, with increased communication, certainly communications coming from the rebel side, the governments have to rethink the way they manage their communications, There's obviously less room for propaganda. Propaganda has not been completely knocked out by any means. As we see in social media, it takes on a life of its own. Rebel groups also have access to these tools and are able to use communications, social media, mass communications tools to their own ends.
You mentioned FM radio, and I know you were involved in setting up a station in Juba. Do you want to speak to that for a bit? What was the motivation there?
Okay. At a personal level, I wanted to spend more time in the region, and I was very interested, in fact, fascinated by the different things that were happening in South Sudan at that time. And I thought communications, improving communications would be a significant contribution to the situation.
And there was no FM radio station in Juba. Is that fairly common then across a lot of regions, or was it abnormal for Juba? Or
okay, FM radio stations, the biggest challenge they face is that they only reach 20 to 30 kilometers beyond line of sight. So, and an FM radio station, you need power, of course. You need certain level of infrastructure generally. So it's FM radio stations are restricted to towns. As I said, 30, 40 kilometers beyond line of sight, but over hilly terrain, it would be significantly less. So there's lots of variables, but large areas, large parts of rural Africa don't have access to FM radio.
That's probably a good segue into infodemics. You recently wrote a paper on infodemics, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was in the context of communication management in response to humanitarian crisis.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you explain what infodemics is, why it's important, and then I guess, what might be done to address it?
Infodemics is the complete overload of information and data. Mm-hmm. And now, as we were talking already about digital information or digital media, the amount of information and data that we have access to at any one time is far greater than anything we've had before. So this, of course, will become easier to manage. We're already seeing early developments in AI around management of a lot of this data, but human agency or our capacity to adapt and make the best of our environment has always depended on our capacity to identify issues, take in information, make the best decisions on those.
Now, this was in communication management response to a humanitarian crisis. Is that a special case, I guess? And is there what additional considerations would there be in that sort of situation?
So this is a humanitarian crisis, of course, is written large. So this is everything from a natural disaster, bushfires in Canada recently, many people would be able to identify with, and to take an example home, but to floods and, of course, conflict or wars.
So what's the general idea then is during these times, there's going to be an influx in information, and there's the challenge of managing, I guess, for another example, I guess you could use COVID and a lot of the misinformation that was spread around that. We even had, I think Facebook started censoring information that was going around. Is that the general idea of infodemics? So
infodemics is just the enormous amount of information. It's an epidemic of information, an infodemic. So it's making sense of everything that you have. And the piece that you referred to that I wrote on was for managers, different institutions, emergency relief development organizations, or relief organizations, emergency relief organizations that might find themselves in an emergency, whether it's a natural disaster or a conflict zone. And it's just how to manage that information. How for them on a daily basis, how do they sift through everything that's coming through, and how do you make decisions based on that?
Right. So it doesn't necessarily discriminate between misinformation and good information. It's simply a large amount of information and how to.
Yes, of course, and some of it's good and
Yes.
some of it's bad, and that's the key is how to deal or how to sift through that quickly, because of course you have resource constraints. The resources at your disposal are quite finite, and they'll always be pressed, and you're trying to make best use of them. So how do you make best use of all of the information that's coming in? How do you sift through and identify what's useful, what's credible, what's not?
Yeah, and I guess it's not only important for the team that's responding to the event, but it's probably more applicable to the to the public perceptions of the event. Is that correct?
Yep, that's part of it, of course. But it's if you're managing, let me say, humanitarian relief, if you're operating an ambulance in a situation like that, and in a civil conflict, where do you know is safe? Where is it safe to go? What's the local knowledge about you and the local knowledge and thinking about you and your organization before you dispatch an ambulance to a particular area? Will your people be safe? So there's those sort of daily issues, but then there's also how do you present yourself in that, and how do you build the credibility of that institution or of your organization, so that these people can continue to do their work with support, ideally by all of the stakeholders and people there.
Yeah.
So there's lots of different parts of this. It's infodemics as the inflow of information. What do you do? How you manage that information? How you respond to that information? These are all other issues.
Yeah, it's quite an undertaking, and it's going to vary depending on the complexity of that situation. I mean, even during relatively less complex mediations, like a two-party single-issue dispute, a mediator should be constantly mindful of managing the information that's presented, even from setting the agenda, taking into consideration the order that the information is presented, to actively sifting through the information in real time, keeping the discussions relevant on track. And that in itself can be challenging, yet in a peace process or an agency responding to a humanitarian crisis, this can be a daunting yet absolutely critical undertaking. And I know this is a big topic, but can you provide any general suggestions on how to approach this?
Of course, it depends on an almost infinite number of variables, and each case will be very, very different. I think that in this sense, the main constraint is capacity and the resources at your disposal. And a rough rule of thumb that I've always found useful on the ground for that is to cross-reference incoming information from at least 3 independent sources. Obviously, this can be very subjective, and there's need for critical judgment in identifying what an independent source is. But remember, you're getting information from a very wide range of different sources, from your staff to media, international media, local media, the protagonists themselves. 3 should be the bare minimum.
Right. 3 independent.
It depends
resources.
It depends on the point that some issues will be a lot more important than others, and some you might want considerably more than 3 independent sources. But that should be a bare minimum.
The rule of 3, that's a great tip. Let's shift gears now, and we've talked about some of the challenges and dangers of increased communication channels and greater access to communication technologies. You've run a number of sensitization campaigns. Can you briefly describe how communication channels can be used for sensitization? So how do we leverage them to create a positive impact?
Awareness is sensitizing stakeholders and general public to particular issues. And once people have an understanding or a better understanding of a situation, the response or the answer is usually very obvious. And obviously different sides will respond differently, but I think this is where the task is for the mediator to clearly identify and help the different stakeholders identify the differences between their needs and interests as they work towards a peaceful solution to the conflict.
Mm. Just so people understand what we're talking about here, do you have a couple examples of a sensitization campaign, whether it was successful or not, but just an example?
A good example that I often refer to was a program I was involved in implementing with UN Food and Agricultural Organization, and this involved the registration of customary land rights, or the recording and registration of customary land rights in a part of Western Uganda that had been subject to a long-running dispute, primarily between central government and traditional leaders. It was highly politicized. Community was fractured on a number of different issues at multiple levels. It was a very tense time to be going in and talking to people about land. But everybody was suffering from the land problem across the region. People were simply not able to buy and sell land, and very few people felt secure about their land. So the key to this was communication and making everybody very aware of what we were doing, that we were there registering people's plots, that everybody had access to this information, that it was a very transparent process, that there was no room to politicize. In the past, activities of this nature had been heavily politicized. Politicians would come in, different politicians would step in and make allegations for or against central government. And this would whip up high levels of hysteria, either way, as I said, for or against government, but with clear messaging and communications, with a high level of awareness of the work being done. It removed opportunities or vacuums that spoilers could exploit to retell the story in their particular way.
That's great. Thanks. So we're sensitizing the public to an issue, a project, or whatever it might be, by creating awareness, and in this case, leaving no room for spoilers to muddy up the process. Could you just talk a bit more about the idea of spoilers moving into informational vacuums?
Okay, well, a vacuum is self-explanatory. It's obviously where there is a vacuum in information, people simply don't know what's happening, and there will almost always be spoilers, and the spoilers can come at very different levels and many different levels. Some can be just looking for short-term media gain or benefit from a situation.
Right.
They're often relatively minor and innocuous. And then they're more sinister, conscious or planned initiatives to scuttle a peace agreement. And these ones, of course, all need to be dealt with accordingly. But it's, as I said, usually it comes from misinformation or a vacuum in information. So if everybody's aware of what the situation is, what the challenges are, what the positions of the different actors are, it's usually very obvious what needs to be done, or the best course of action, the best way forward.
Right.
So, as I said, it's just about keeping everybody informed and keeping the process transparent.
Hmm. Any tips to share on implementing these campaigns?
I think the general advice for running campaigns is very communication and awareness campaigns is very much the same. Whether you're pushing for peace or you're selling Jello, You need to have a clear objective. You need to properly assess the target audiences. You need to develop and present the message in an engaging way that makes sense and impacts on the intended audience. And you need to develop or identify the most effective way or means to convey the message, and develop a workable strategy. So these are the same things across the board. There are many reasons why you might want to run a communication campaign, of course, but it needs to be grounded and effective. You need to have an understanding of what's going on, of course. You need to listen to all the information and examine all of the information that's coming in. And in this day and age, that can be a lot of information.
So we're back to operating within a climate of infodemics. We have the need to understand what's going on, yet there's an incredible amount of information to sift through. What's the balance point here? If you need to conduct your business, whether a campaign, peace process, whatever it might be, what considerations should be given to the amount and type of information that's informing your understanding of the situation?
Okay. This is a very interesting point, and there's a lot of debate and discussion within peace building around this. How much information do you need to know, or how well do you need to understand a situation before you're able to mediate and effectively engage the relevant stakeholders? I think most would agree that you need to be as alert and aware as possible, given the time and resources at your disposal, and that's really just about listening to information from all possible sources. Certainly the stakeholders engaged in the mediation, other third parties and other actors, news media, just to be aware of what's happening, and never to underestimate the importance and the power of local knowledge, local information. I think that's critical in being able to operate in any sort of environment. Certainly a politically charged environment, as you'll find in a mediation scenario. So it's really just listening to people, keeping an open mind, and I think that's it. In sociology, there's what they call an emic and etic perspective. Are you familiar with that?
No.
So an emic perspective is a perspective from within the social group, and an etic perspective is from without. If I was looking at a conflict between Canada and America, if I can explain, and would your perspective be better at understanding what's happening? And yours would be an emic perspective, because as a Canadian, you understand Canada, and
right.
You're a neighbor to America, you understand America, and so your perspective, how valid is it, as opposed to mine? So actually, yours, you specialize, but the trade-off is objectivity. Yeah? Whereas I would have an etic perspective, coming as an outsider.
Right.
I don't have the in-depth understanding or knowledge of either Canada or America, but I can have there'll be greater objectivity. And ideally, at the end of the day, you need both. You need an emic and an etic perspective on it. But this is a debate that's been going on for many years, not just in mediation and peace building, but in sociology and the humanities across the board. You've got to really focus on your tools as a mediator. The main thing there you have to arm yourself is basically your tools as your mediation tool.
Mm-hmm.
So,
should you be assessing the amount of emic versus etic knowledge in trying to, if it seems out of balance, trying to consult one of the other sources, or bring them into the mix, purposely bring them into the mix to create a informational balance there?
It'd be very difficult to do. Ideally, yes. As a mediator will usually be coming from the outside and will automatically have an etic perspective. Depends on who you engage in support of the mediation. Ideally, you'd have people on staff that represent, or not represent, but come or can relate to the different stakeholder groups, and will be able to help you understand exactly what their points are. And that's where you'd get your a more emic perspective from.
Could you shift into some general communication tips? Anything at all here that you can share with us?
Maintain your integrity. You need to establish your goals and your principles, your operating procedures and principles as you become involved, and you don't veer from them without good reason. Of course, there are always flexibilities required, and where you're flexible and where you're not, that's of course another question. But it's imperative to always be as open and as honest as possible, and you'll be respected for it.
Yeah, so that's not just applicable in peace talks, but discussions in the boardroom to the family dinner table, right? That's just exactly, 101
yes.
there.
Yeah, that's the ideal generally, yes.
Yeah. You've spent quite amount of time living in Africa. How many years has it been?
Around 21 years.
21
I
years.
arrived here June 2000.
Okay.
A 10-day assignment that has gone on for 21 years.
What do you mind if I ask what that 10-day assignment was?
I was working with the Carter Center and working on the implementation of the Nairobi Peace Agreement, the 1999 Nairobi Peace Agreement between Sudan and Uganda.
So a 10-day assignment turned into 21 years. Can you share any general advice that you've picked up for peace builders and foreign aid workers that would help them sort of adjust and integrate into that environment? Is there any sort of tips you can give on that?
Basically, just to be yourself and to ground yourself well and remain true to your principles. Be aware, contextualize everything, your surroundings, and stick within your mandate, minimize your expectations, and always remain optimistic.
That's a great list. I jotted them down here to recap. Be yourself, stay true to your principles, beware or contextualize your surroundings, stay within your mandate, minimize expectations, and stay optimistic. Now, obviously, these tips are pulling upon years of experience in the field and are great advice. It's certainly challenging work, yet rewarding. What keeps you going?
One of the things I still find highly inspirational working in challenging environments, from natural disasters such as bushfires to conflict or post-conflict environments, is seeing people in the most desperate situations still being able to find it within themselves to laugh or smile.
I think we'll leave it with that. Thanks for your time, Chris. It's been great.
Thank you very much, Warren. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more from international experts digging into a range of topics on conflict, power, and persuasion, subscribe to your favorite podcast app or visit us at cian.org. That's CIIAN.org.